So, Casey, what do you know about design?
I mean, I know that it's something I hire other people to do for me. This is really not my forte.
Well, there is an app in the design world called Figma.
Ah, yes.
Which is sort of like an app that, people who build apps and services use to sort of design them. And the analogy I've heard used is that Figma is to Photoshop as Google Docs is to Microsoft Word. It's kind of like a more collaborative online way of doing designs, especially with a team.
Yeah, when it first came out, people started calling it multiplayer Photoshop because in addition to running in a browser, which was like a cool enough party trick on its own, multiple people could work on the same file at the same time, which at the time was really a revolution.
Yeah, it was a fast-growing product. Designers really loved it. And then something happened, which was that in 2022, Adobe announced that it was going to buy Figma for $20 billion.
Making it one of the biggest acquisitions of that year.
Yeah, so Adobe is this sort of giant in the world of design. They make Photoshop and Premiere and all these other tools that designers and film editors and other people use for work. And this deal was a big deal in Silicon Valley, but it also caught the attention of regulators who said, wait a minute, this sort of looks like a big company kind of acquiring a startup, a company that might potentially compete with it. And maybe that's going to harm competition and innovation in this market. And so the companies sort of pulled back from the deal and it fell through.
Yeah, and at that point, you might say that the deal for Adobe was just a figment of its imagination.
That's pretty good.
Thanks.
So why are we talking about this story now? Well, one of the biggest changes in the tech world in the past few years is not actually what's happening in Silicon Valley. It's been what's been happening in Washington. We've talked on this show with Lina Khan, the chair of the FTC, and Jonathan Cantor, the assistant attorney general, who's sort of in charge of their antitrust enforcement against big tech companies. And both of them have sort of made the point that, that one of the things that harms innovation and competition in the tech industry is this pattern of small startups growing very quickly and then getting acquired by these big tech companies who are sort of afraid of competition.
Effectively knocking pieces off the chessboard to ensure that they will always win.
Exactly. And so their point is that, well, if you want to increase competition in the tech industry, you have to actually make it harder for these big tech companies to acquire smaller startups, especially when there's sort of a direct competitive threat to the bigger company. And so this Adobe-Figma deal, I would say, is sort of one of the first major test cases for what happens if you actually just sort of tighten the rules on these kinds of acquisitions and make it harder for big tech companies to acquire small, promising startups. And how does that sort of ripple throughout the tech industry? And so that's what I wanted to ask my colleague Erin Griffith about today. Erin covers startups and venture capital, and she just wrote a big story about this Figma Adobe deal falling through and what it sort of means for Silicon Valley as a whole.
Let's bring her in here.
Erin Griffith, welcome back to Hard Fork.
Thanks for having me.
So this deal between Adobe and Figma fell through in December. You've just written a story about sort of what happened at Figma after this deal collapsed. Just tell us what you found in your reporting.
Yeah, so I talked to just about everyone that I could, employees, former employees, soon-to-be former employees, investors, kind of people from all sides of the spectrum. And the main thing is that there's just relief that the deal is over. It's been a year and a half or more of just the kind of being in limbo, which for a startup is so hard. Momentum is so important. You have to be constantly growing. And there are a bunch of employees that are potentially millionaires that don't actually know if they're going to see those millions or not. And so there's a little bit of relief that it's just over, but there's also, these questions of okay, well, when will I see those millions, or will I? The company's in kind of a weird place right now. They kind of had this really rough year and a half where now they're kind of picking up the pieces.
So it's obviously been a rough time at Figma. There are a lot of people who thought they were going to be rich this year who are either going to be rich potentially a long time from now or maybe even never. But your story also goes into a different kind of shockwave that this sent through Silicon Valley, which is that acquisitions are a big part of how this town works, right? And that acquisitions are how money and talent get recycled into the ecosystem. It provides a sort of a launching pad for all the next generation of startups. So how has Silicon Valley reacted in general to this news?
I mean, I'm actually kind of surprised by the reaction a little bit. I've been asking investors about this for like 5 years. You know, I don't know if you guys remember.
Wait, you knew that the Figma acquisition wasn't going to go through?
Yes, I've been like, and people are confused, and yeah, they don't, no. So like, I don't know if you guys remember, like Harry's, the razor company sold that, but that deal got kind of broken up. Plaid, the payments company, were supposed to sell to Visa, that got broken up. Both of those companies were able to raise money later, but they still haven't exited. So, you know, the investors are painting an optimistic picture, but like it could be a really long time before they exit. And most of the investors I talk to, they don't seem that concerned. They're like, oh, well, yeah, Apple, Amazon, the big tech companies that are under antitrust scrutiny, they're on the sidelines, but there are other buyers. And I kind of think it's a bigger deal than that because, I mean, just to take one stat that I found, like 90% of exits in 2019, which was a big year for IPOs, were acquisitions, not IPOs. And like the IPOs are where the big money exits come from, but like the vast majority of startups end up selling. And that's how
I think this is a point that we should sort of take a beat on, because I think this is something that may not be obvious outside the tech industry. When venture capitalists put money into a startup, there are kind of two things that they're going for. One is that the company becomes huge and goes public, right? And then they can pull money, then their shares get converted into shares of the public company and they get to sell and they get a return from that. The other, and what you're saying, the sort of more frequent outcome for a venture-backed startup is that it would get acquired, and then the investors who supported the startup from the beginning get paid as part of that acquisition. So those are kind of the classic exits in venture capital, and it sounds like beyond just this Figma case, it sounds like the sort of the exit strategy of let's sell this startup to a bigger company is becoming much more challenging.
Totally. Yeah. And like that is the way this industry works. The venture capitalists get that money back and then they use that to raise their next fund because their investors are happy and they want to give them more money. Angel investors, who are kind of the first people who put money into startups, they use that and they like invest in their next in their friends' companies. And it's all like kind of incestuous, but it's like a circle of life that perpetuates the new creation of startups. And like, I talked to one investor in the story, Adam Nash. He used his earnings from the startups he worked at, like LinkedIn, to invest in more than 130 of his friends' startups. And like that's how this works. And so all these Figma employees that would have now become angel investors are not. And, a lot of these venture investors, they kind of like made their reputations like, Figma, I got this big winner. I got this $20 billion exit. And like, that's not the case anymore. I mean, I talked to one investor who had invested in lots of funds, and some of the funds, he was set to get paid on Figma's exit from 6 different entities. So like that's like how incestuous this is, and that's actually just what makes it work here. And so, if those acquisitions dry up, that can, have a really big chilling effect on an industry that's already outside of AI struggling.
So let's talk about why. What changed that these acquisitions are just having a harder time getting through?
I mean, regulatory.
Yeah.
Just
which
simply.
regulators?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously there's Lena Khan, and the FTC has been scrutinizing every single deal, including now minority deals. I mean, she just said that she's looking
minority deals, meaning a deal in which
an
investor would buy a minority stake in the company.
Yeah. So Microsoft's investment in OpenAI and Google and Amazon's investments in Anthropic, the AI companies, those are minority stakes, but they're now investigating those for potential antitrust problems. So that's like going even a step further. But what killed the Adobe-Figma deal was the European regulators that have been even more strict. The British regulators, the CMA, which is the authority there, they essentially looked at this deal and said, well, Figma and Adobe could potentially have been competitors down the line. Therefore, this deal is, eliminating competition, and we think that it's bad and stifling innovation. So they're taking an even, stronger stance against this. So yeah, it's raising the bar, as one investor told me, it's raising the bar for even engaging in acquisition talks for a startup, because this is a huge risk that the deal might not actually go through. And, one thing that Figma did that's really smart, it's raising the bar for breakup fees. Figma's getting paid $1 billion as a breakup fee from Adobe. So that's,
breakup fees are fees that get paid when like a deal doesn't happen.
Right.
This has always been my dream, by the way, is to get paid $1 billion for just nothing happening.
Well, you should know that the hard fork breakup fee is $1 billion from you to me.
Oh, no.
So if this show breaks up, you owe me $1 billion.
I really should have read
that was
that
in your
contract
contract
before I signed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people listening listening to this might be saying, what's the big deal? Like, we have this regulatory regime that's gotten tougher on startups being acquired by tech giants. So far, it seems like from your story, the people who are most affected by that are like Figma employees who don't get their huge paydays from this deal. And you have, venture capitalists who are unhappy that maybe they can't as easily sell their portfolio companies to large acquirers and get paid. But why does this matter sort of beyond the world of tech investing? What are the stakes of this new regulatory environment for average users?
Yeah, I guess it kind of just impacts the way that it impacts the incentives for people who are maybe interested in starting a company and, think that they could follow in the footsteps of many of our most famous and powerful and frankly admired business leaders. And often the way to do that is to build a company and sell it to a larger one. It impacts the way that this kind of innovation is going to be funded. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a good or a bad thing, but it's definitely going to change the way this system works. And I think we'll be seeing the ramifications of that playing out for a long time.
I can tell you, when I started Platformer, it was with the goal of selling it to Adobe for $20 billion. And now I'm like, in this regulatory environment? I don't think so, honey. So that's going to be a challenge. But let me throw a couple of counterexamples in here, Erin, because while everything that you said is true, at the same time, Microsoft was somehow able to buy Activision Blizzard for almost $69 billion, right? Which was just a clear case of a giant company getting even more giant. So that seems to me to suggest that at least some window is still open. And I have to say, when I saw that Adobe was acquiring Figma, my first thought was the cost of Photoshop is going to go up. Like, Figma is going to get folded into the Adobe Creative Suite and the price is going to go up. And so you don't even have to be a hipster antitrust person to find an excuse to block this deal. You could just say, this just kind of seems like maybe we shouldn't allow it. So is the Figma deal maybe an outlier in this whole thing?
No, I don't know about that, but I will agree with your point that there are a lot of Figma customers that were kind of celebrating this. And I think that just in general, even if you're not a Figma user, a lot of people complain about the power of big faceless corporations and how, they kind of are constantly finding new ways to screw customers. So like in general, I can see the concerns and like why you would prefer that this product that you love that's like, pretty cheap and not corporate and tries to do right by its customers stays independent. So like I think there were a lot of Figma customers that were celebrating this. And a lot of people who maybe don't like certain Adobe policies or the way that they sell or package their products. So yeah, I can definitely see an argument for that.
Do you hear from any founders who are thinking about their sort of exit strategies differently in light of these new regulatory pressures? I mean, one complaint that you'll hear from venture capitalists about the aggressive regulation of tech mergers and acquisitions is that, maybe someday the next Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger don't start Instagram because they know that even if they succeed beyond their wildest dreams, they're not going to be able to sell their company to Facebook for billions of dollars. You might sort of see a drop-off in startup founders deciding to take a risk on something new because one of these two classic avenues for getting rich on a startup is now not closed, but harder.
Totally. And I've heard that argument before, not ever from a founder, though. It's more from like the commentators or VCs. And it's kind of BS in a way because the other thing that they'll turn around and say is like, well, no one aims to sell their company. Their goal is always to go public. And, that's people start it with the sort of the biggest possible dream and maybe selling is like the second best. And I think there's always going to be like people who are wildly ambitious and trying to start new companies and hoping to make it rich that way. So I don't see it stopping that. And, investors being always very optimistic about everything. That's kind of like their job. They see a whole world of other potential buyers who maybe aren't as well known as Google, Apple, Amazon that are now taking advantage of this moment, like Salesforce, for example. That companies that are big, have a lot of money, and haven't quite caught the regulatory scrutiny yet that some of the biggest ones have.
Right. And do we think that there are going to be any kind of new exit strategies for startups? I mean, if you had the sort of classic model of you either go public or you get acquired as sort of the ways to succeed and get rich during a startup, are people at these companies and investment firms thinking about other ways that they could potentially cash out?
I'm glad you asked that, actually, because I've been having this conversation with a lot of people. The secondary market is very hot right now.
Explain what that is.
And the secondary market is essentially a fancy way of saying it's a private stock market. Startups own shares that are private, and only sophisticated investors like venture capital investors can buy them. However, there is a growing market of people who are buying and selling shares in privately held stock. It's called the secondary market, and that has really, that got a lot of attention right before Facebook's IPO because people were trading private Facebook stock before it went public. And over the last decade or so, it has gotten bigger and bigger. And so there is generally a market for people to buy shares in these private startups before they go public. And that is becoming increasingly robust. And so that's a way that some investors are being able to cash out before an IPO can happen.
Yep. And of course, Kevin, don't count out that other classic way for a startup founder to make money, crypto scams.
And what do you think this means for the tech giants? Because historically, buying smaller startups has been a way to kind of like extend their relevance. I'm thinking of, Facebook buying Instagram and WhatsApp, which sort of became the next phase of that business's growth. So if you are a Facebook, if you are an Amazon, if you are a Google, are you really worried about it now being tougher to acquire some of these fledgling, promising young startups?
Definitely. That is essentially how these companies stay relevant is they try to build something innovative in-house. They're too clunky and slow-moving and out of good ideas. So they buy something and hope that infuses them with new life and their stock lives to see another day. That is not happening at the big tech companies at all. And so that I would be nervous if I were them. Microsoft has obviously found a way around that by investing in OpenAI without buying it outright, and being very careful to not own more than 50% of the company. But even that's now being scrutinized. So yeah, it's definitely a signal to big tech companies that they need to start building their most innovative stuff in-house.
Yeah, and I should say, that is actually what the regulators want to happen, right? That is part of the sort of hypothesis here, is that if you force, if you make it harder for tech giants to kind of gobble up smaller potential competitors, then it will actually result in more innovation overall, because the big companies will have to stay ahead of the small startups, and the small startups will sort of be able to flourish independently without sort of getting gobbled up by these larger institutions.
Yeah, that's kind of, if you read the CMA's investigation of Adobe, they had this project that was ongoing for a long time called Project Spice, and it was it had other names too, but they mostly called it Project Spice. And
I think I saw that on Cinemax when I was a kid.
And it was and it was essentially going to compete with Figma, and they canceled it 1 week before the acquisition of Figma was announced. And they said, in their responses, this was never going to compete with Figma, and it was a failure, and we canceled it because it was really bad, and we could never compete with Figma. But that kind of makes the point for the regulators too. You couldn't compete, and so you bought this thing instead. So yeah, it's that's a perfect example of what you're talking about.
Yeah. As you're describing what happened at Figma, I'm sort of thinking, isn't this just a case study of how regulation works and how it should work? Isn't this a success story for regulators? Because it sounds like what you're describing is a company in Adobe that now has to sort of develop its own independent strategy for competing with Figma, which it can no longer buy. You're also describing a Figma that now has to think about how to compete with Adobe rather than just being sort of swallowed up by it. So it seems like there is more competition in that particular market than there would have been if this deal had been allowed to go through. So isn't this just kind of proving what regulators have been saying all along?
Well, that was very well articulated, but I think I have to step in here and give the company's perspective on that, which would strongly disagree with you. They've obviously fought this every step of the way, and they, expressed their disagreement with the British regulators' findings that they were taking competition out of the market. They believe that they were not competitive. But yeah, I think that's your point is well taken. That the regulators dug into this, concluded that these two companies would have been competitors had they not decided to merge, and said, we want to block this. And then they asked for some really absurd remedies. They were like, okay, well, you guys can merge, I guess, if Adobe spins off Photoshop or Illustrator, or Figma spins off Figma Design, which is essentially all of Figma. And so, of course, the companies were like, no. But so, yeah, I mean, essentially, yes, this is regulation working. I think a lot of people in the tech industry, obviously, including Adobe and Figma, would say it's an egregious overreach, and they don't like the way they're interpreting the law.
So, Erin, you've written, among other things, about the culture of Figma, whose employees, I believe, call themselves Figmates. How is the culture changing in response to this deal falling apart?
I mean, it's probably the same. That my understanding of the culture of Figma is very earnest. They like to sing.
Feeling thankful that I can count on you all. Surrounded by the world's greatest team, this is Figma. This is Figma.
They have a theme song. Or they had.
Wait, they have a theme song?
They had a theme song. How
does it go?
The chorus was, Figma, I dig ya. Design used to be such an enigma. I'm not going to sing it. And it had a rap verse that referenced Adobe at one point. Who the heck's Adobe? I think it said 10 or 15 years from now, people are going to say, who the heck's Adobe? Figma's here to stay.
Wait, they made a software diss track?
Yeah.
Is that...
Yes. I mean, I don't think it was meant for public consumption. I saw a video of it, but unlike their musical, which they put out in the quarantine, which is on YouTube and is
required viewing for Park Fork listeners.
Wait, there's a Figma musical?
Yes, it is very elaborate. It's kind of about quarantine, the early days of quarantine. I actually had to turn it off because I was having flashbacks to all the jokes that we made about we're all stuck inside, and how traumatizing that was for everyone. So yeah. Anyway, so yeah, they're a little dorky. This is not the Uber culture of let's be hardcore and step on toes and just
Yeah, Uber also actually had a musical. It was
I think it was called "It's Not a Crime If You Don't Get Caught."
Yes,
yeah,
that was the showstopper.
Yeah, it was the big number closing Act 1.
And FTX actually had a musical. It was called Scamilton.
It was a great one.
Erin Griffith, thanks
cool.
for coming on
Yeah.
Hard Fork.
Thanks for
Erin.
having me.